It's been nearly a decade since the release of Toy Story 3, but in a few months we'll be getting a fourth installment into the venerated Pixar flagship commemorating the big CGI movie that changed the face of animation forever, and completely murdered the world of traditional 2D animation for the foreseeable future. And on one hand, it's easy to feel the Pixar sequel fatigue since any film outside of the Toy Story series has been an exercise in pointless tedium where they mainly retread the plot of the first movie. I'm looking at you, Finding Dory and The Incredibles 2. Or we get stuff like the middling and unnecessary Monsters University, which is completely pointless since the whole point of the first film is that scaring kids for energy is an immoral and inhuman practice, especially since the power of clean laughter is much more sustainable. So why should we be invested in watching the monsters go to college so they can perform what we later learn are cruel and inhuman acts of scaring children? And the less that is said about the Cars trilogy, the better.
Hey, that tickle.
But despite the stigma, the Toy Story series has not seen a bad movie, and typically I don't like making speculation theory videos. There is something I see in the fourth film teaser that I think ties to the larger themes of the series as a whole. So don't worry, we're not getting into that Pixar theory shared universe bullcrap. Welcome to Lobster Theory, and today we're going to talk about how Toy Story 4 is setting up the Pixar multiverse. We're going to learn that the entire Toy Story franchise is a prequel to Up, and Andy actually ages up into Carl. Ha 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 ha! Get it? I made a bad punny pun, but it's not bad because I'm totally self-aware. And in truth, all the doors in every Pixar movie are all connected to the Monsters, Inc. universe, which also contains a portal to the land of the dead as seen in Coco, but this is all tied to the good dinosaur because Spot is the great ancestor of every human character we've ever seen in a Pixar film. And the radiation from the living toys is ultimately what created the genesis for superpowers in The Incredibles. And this is all gonna pay off when Remy the Rat finally gets to meet up with Dory in a pet shop as they team up to find Nemo again. Yeah, all this theory crafting stuff is mostly stupid bullshit. You gotta love you gotta back it. Love a 10 out of you, don't you grab it. So there's not a ton to break down in the first Toy Story teaser since it's just a reintroduction to the main cast and supporting toy characters, but in the Circle of Friendship we're introduced to a new character, Forky, who seems to be having an existential crisis in terms of being alive, screaming how he's not a toy and being horrified about the prospect of being alive.
I don't belong here! I'm not a toy!
Now what makes this interesting is how it ties into the two most central themes that are seen throughout the Toy Story films, and those are creativity and death. The theme of creativity has always existed throughout the films. The opening scene of the original Toy Story sees Andy playing his own made-up game scenarios with his toys, quite literally creating his own Toy Story. And it's his affection and interest that ultimately drives the core loyalty of the toys themselves, who seek to bask in his attention and affection, which is why the introduction of the more contemporary toy of Buzz Lightyear, who represents the more homogenized, branded era of toys in the modern era, is such a threat. He poses a direct danger to the more antiquated toys in Andy's bedroom that represent the past, where you made your own fun and didn't need a prepackaged backstory. The key difference being how Andy's other toys reflect the 1960s or 1970s compared to the toys seen in the 80s, which all came with a cartoon show that served as a vehicle to push said toys and create a narrative universe, which would give kids an incentive to, of course, buy more toys.
What do we have here?
It's Castle Grayskull. And it's mine. Not so fast, Beastman. He-Man!
You can pit He-Man against Beastman, playing for the power of Castle Grayskull. You have to put the castle together. Beastman's escaping.
What's wrong, Dad? Dad, you saved the castle!
Castle Grayskull from the Masters of the Universe collection. He-Man and Beastman, each sold separately.
You're in my control.
Think again. Four heroes fighting to stop Dr. Paranoid and his evil creations from taking over the world. They fight, they bite, they kick some serious spin.
His special power is the right hand roundhouse punch. he sends the competition to a watery grave. Boom!
Three sharks. Ripster. Slade. Jab.
Sledge the Hammerhead loves to floor the competition with the flying headbutt.
And Big Slam Jump.
Whale Shot. Say hello to that round mound of pound and his power slam. Very deadly.
Fighting to defeat Dr. Piranoid, half man, half piranha monster.
Time to go spear fishing.
Go, fish, blowfish.
Hand shark! A good fish! Rocky Balboa action. Do 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 do.
Soul separately, new from Mattel. Awesome.
Hand shark!
It's this fiction that sort of drives the subtext of Toy Story, the idea that Buzz Lightyear, with his prepackaged fictional backstory, leads to a more homogeneous play pattern, free from the creative reinterpretation seen when Andy played on his own, with his toys that didn't come from licenses. It's sort of reflective of the two different play styles seen at the end of the Lego Movie, where we go to the real world, where the son had a more spontaneous play pattern, mixing worlds and elements that wouldn't go together, compared to his father, who was more of a collector who liked to keep each thing separate and internally consistent, with his more rigid and anal play pattern. And it's these play patterns that give the toys life, both metaphorically and figuratively. Not that we ever really needed an explanation for how the toys come to life, it's mainly just a fun idea about the secret world that exists when you're just out of sight. But it seems that might change in the fourth film, where we specifically learn that what gives a toy life is when a human's imagination gives them a purpose, that their lives are entirely determined by our interest in them and the stories we imbue them with, which is what makes Forky and his existential crisis so interesting. He is horrified because he knows he should not exist. He should just be a fork. But because his owner, presumably the girl Bonnie, who Andy gave his toys to at the end of Toy Story 3, turned him into a toy through a creative imagination, he was given a life he never asked for. Through the sheer act of creation, he has a soul. So if the act of creation of imbuing life and personality into a husk of plastic and cloth can give a fork life, then it's safe to presume that this rule would hold fast for just about any other toy, as well as any other object that kids play with. It shouldn't be surprising that a core theme of Toy Story revolves around creativity, given how the series has become the flagship of computer animation, the cornerstone which the Pixar dynasty was built. A literal animator's toy box that was built around the limitations of the technology, which couldn't bring photorealistic human characters to life, which was still outside of the medium's reach. The idea that the principle of storytelling and creativity would be so instrumental to the series isn't surprising, and you can see it in Toy Story 3, where the film opens with a much bigger, more lavish interpretation of Andy's play fantasies. But that brings us to the second factor that's been present in most of the Toy Story sequels. This is the thing that has made the film such incredible tearjerkers, and that is how the series handled the notion of mortality and death. The idea is introduced in Toy Story 2, where Woody gets his arm torn slightly. We see that while technically the toys' bodies do not age, they are vulnerable to real-world decay, and their lifespans are also intrinsically tied to the interest of their owners. As their owners grow up, they move on towards other things, and the toys are forced into a state of purgatory in limbo, where they lie down and are forgotten. This is touched most poignantly in the story of Cowgirl Jessie, and how her original owner grew out of her and discarded her, and how traumatizing this experience ultimately was for her. Then the ultimate dilemma is left up to Woody. What will he choose? Will he continue his mortal life with Andy despite knowing what his inevitable fate will be once Andy grows up? That he'll ultimately be discarded and thrown away into toy purgatory? Or will he choose the immortality of being featured in a Japanese toy museum where he can be appreciated for all eternity while his friends are forced to suffer that fate? Ultimately, Woody comes to terms with his mortality, choosing to live a mortal life with his friends, filled with companionship and love, instead of a cold, sterile, immortal one where he would essentially be alone. Woody knows what the future will inevitably bring, but instead of looking to run from it, he comes to terms with it by choosing to find meaning from the relationships he has with Andy and his friends in the present. The idea of toy death and toy mortality is further explored in the third film, where Andy is finally all grown up and ready to set out for college. The death of the toys has come. The purgatory that Jessie warned them about is here, and in the most affecting scene of the film, the toys even face their physical death as they are threatened to be incinerated by a trash compactor holding each other's hands, taking refuge in each other as they face both physical and spiritual annihilation. Of course they survive, and they find a new form of life as Andy passes on his toys to Bonnie. What I find really interesting about this is the fact that Toy Story 2 and 3 were directed by Lee Unkrich, who also directed Coco and has a story credit for all these movies as well. In Coco, we are introduced to the idea of the second death, where once all living memory is gone, even in the afterlife you are forced to fade away into a void of nothing, which of course connects to Coco's main theme of respecting your ancestors and keeping their memories and legacies alive so they don't experience that second death. This can also be seen in Toy Story 3, where Andy passes on his toys to another person, giving Bonnie the gift of play and creation, allowing her to create her own narratives, and thus keep the legacy of his toys alive even after he's grown beyond them. So the generational passage of the toys from one person to the next is how they can be kept alive, similar to how the deceased ancestors in Coco's legacies are remembered from one generation to the next. And it feels like this is going to be explored even further in Toy Story 4 through Forky's quite literal existential crisis. There's also another clue, the fact that Tom Hanks said he was bawling at the end of his final voice recording for Toy Story 4. That he couldn't face the crew like he usually does when he's recording, that he was going for something very specific, and even going as far as to think that this will be the last time he voices Woody. So given how Toy Story has linked the notions of creativity, giving life to these toys, if my speculation is correct, then there's a good chance that in the absence of that creativity that gives the toys their life and spark, that toys will face their ultimate death. And for a series that has always flirts with the notion of mortality, it would be a fitting end to see what happens once Woody and Buzz enter into that final vacuum deprived of what made them special in the first place. The fact that Jessie was so traumatized by being left alone for so long goes to imply that when toys don't have human contact, they essentially enter a state of death where their consciousness is extinguished, where they meet that final oblivion that goes beyond the first and second deaths and fade out of existence entirely.
Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way, do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
And given how the Toy Story series has always been the tearjerker, where we see the mortality of seemingly immortal toys as they come to terms and realize that the lifespans of their owners are not infinite, and as long as their purpose is linked to the people that own them, even they will have to inevitably face that final end, and I think chances are this might be the film where we see the interlocking narrative of creativity and death take its final bow. Of course, this is all speculation, and chances are if it makes another $1 billion, the toys will come back somehow. Maybe the torch will be handed off from Buzz and Woody to the stuffed animals played by Key and Peele. Maybe my speculation is 100% incorrect since I'm basing it entirely off one teaser trailer, but judging from what Pixar has managed to do in the past with the Toy Story, and the implication that Tom Hanks has recorded his lines for the supposedly final time, it appears that at least this incarnation of Toy Story will be the end of an era. We'll ultimately have to wait and see, especially given how the Toy Story sequels are the only Pixar sequels that have been legitimately great compared to things like Finding Dory, Cars 2, and The Incredibles 2. but as someone who appreciates the overall craft the studios put into their films, as well as the tough themes they've tackled, I certainly hope Toy Story 4 will turn me into an emotional wreck in the theater. But hey, that's just a theory. Join us next week as we see if the Toy Story universe is actually a sister universe with Five Nights at Freddy's 4, and Woody is actually the cousin of Freddy Fazbear in Lobster Theory, or not. Cause I'm thirsty for that algorithm love.
Algorithms! Math!
But Jesus Christ, gotta have some standards. So tune in for whatever the heck the next topic I feel like making a video on. And remember, lobster's antennas, but don't you grab it.